Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. Now, before we begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we meet virtually. We pay our respects and thanks to the Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging. We welcome any Indigenous people who are present this afternoon or this morning here in my case. I also acknowledge that the lands we meet on were never ceded, always was, always will be Indigenous lands. So I'm doing an acknowledgement to country as I'm here in Australia. It is something that we always do whenever we do our presentations or webinar series or any of our meetings. Okay, so basically I want to walk you through, as I said, based on my acknowledgement of country. A quick intro I will give you. We will get into a bit understanding of our culture, some of the definitions, the framework that shape that. And then we see how those definitions and framework actually applied in case studies in practice for us. You are future engineering managers. You might be coming as a junior, middle, or senior employee in different places. And so there's a framework that helps us how we influence or we adapt to these cultures, because we may find ourselves moving from our native countries to working in a new country or even a different part of our own country. And it might be differences in those how they operate. And then we jump across to some questions. Right, good. So Anna did want to give me a little introduction. So again, I'm Daren. My pronouns are he, him. I'm speaking from Warang in Gadigal country. For those of us who don't know, Warang is the Aboriginal name for modern-day Sydney. All right, and Gadigal country is the name of the traditional owners of the lands where Sydney sits. Now, so I work as this commercial training manager for this construction consultancy firm here in Australia. Right. Now, I also hold that people and culture portfolio in the firm. Now, it's not the first time I've had to do people and culture. Right. So about 7 years ago, when I worked in the Caribbean, I held a people and culture role where I was a shared services manager for an energy consultancy firm. And I played a major part in shaping that culture of that firm and have been one of their first hire into the company outside of the directors. So that was an interesting role I held there. Now, concurrently, in addition to my training manager role, which sort of, there's an internal aspect as a de facto people and culture, that really consolidated a lot over the past 2 years. I also am a casual academic at Curtin University on their project management program, and then also an adjunct research supervisor at the University of Western Eastern Augustine on their project management program as well. Okay. So again, one of the things we're going to look here is understanding that organizational culture, right, is important in any new employee's experience in a company. All right. It affects the current employees as well. Now, there are various cultures that you as an employee will face when working for anyone. This can be your national culture, organizational, department, something we call peer or project culture, right? Now, how do you as a new employee can get involved in your new job? Now, how do you adapt if you're moving into a new role in that company or even a new country? You know, sometimes we may be transferring from one department to the other or one state to the other. There might be a difference in the way that state office works, the culture of that state office works than from your original state office. All right. So this webinar will discuss these approaches that new employees can use to adapt or influence the culture, right? And these approaches can be applied, as I said before, even if you're junior, middle, or senior employee. And also, this is applicable if you're starting to form your own company as a founder. If you're an entrepreneur, you have to then decide, okay, what kind of culture you're creating and you're building. So, of course, culture has been thrown out as a hot potato. We have these, what we call the culture wars. If you follow the American television series, we also have that as well here in Australia, where everyone seems to see it's a hot potato. And we see it globally, in different countries where we have politicians trying to battle for the control or try to become the arbiter of culture. Questions you have to ask yourself, right? Are you contributing to the culture? Now, again, remember, we have culture from the national level organizational level, department, or peer level. So then, are you contributing to this culture? Are you an influencer? The rise of social media has seen people in influencing culture. Are you appropriator? Also through the rise, it's a very interesting question we often have to ask. Are you an assimilator? For those of us who might find ourselves migrating to other countries, do you assimilate into their culture or moving into different companies? Are you a gatekeeper? Or are you a guide to culture? Right? So what we really got to do is to understand what culture is. Now, I will apply an institutional economics view of it. Now, since my PhD in built environment, there was a focus around institutional economics. Now, the reason I like using institutional economics, and it's useful for you to apply, is because it applies a frame. Now, this is different. Institutional economics is different from microeconomics. Especially on an engineering management degree program, you may cover economics. They may not necessarily cover institutional economics, but that's something I covered at my PhD. And the reason why I use the institutional economics approach is because it provides a framework for explaining why certain rules, practices, and tradition becomes norms, right? So when we see this, is that culture is an embedded, all seen as embedded behaviors that are practiced by social groups, right? So these practices are considered normal actions when people from the same social groups interact. So, for example, these norms are influenced by the various factors. We have history, politics, religion. We also have geography, economics, of course, there's science and technology, natural and built environment, gender, sexuality, and biology. So culture embeds itself into informal institutions, customs, traditions, norms, and religion. And one of the things that has come up for me when I see culture as a framework is that it has structure, there's legitimacy, there's stickiness, there's filters, there's isomorphism. So, in other words, culture has structure because it's made up of different elements, the ones I've just talked about before. It has legitimacy because there are these formal and informal rules. For example, when we see people, do you say hi, good morning? Now, who said that we had to say that? But I guess that's legitimacy of part of it cultural. You say good morning or buenos dias or how are you going in Creole for me here in Trinidad. It's sticky because it persists over time in different participants. That's why, when people say that that's how it is, because that's culture, it's the stickiness of it. It also is learned because it filters our behaviors. A culture, for example, of us, it filters our behavior in terms of you may offer someone a hot beverage as part of a cultural greeting. How are you? Do you want some tea? My thing is good. It's manners, but it's part of filtering. We have to learn behavior. And also there are different forms so it's isomorphic. And as you can see, if you move from one university to another, it's a different culture, or from one company to the other, there are different forms of it. And so therefore it's isomorphic. So in this webinar, I will be dissecting these 5 elements and these components here, and we use it to understand how culture prepares ourselves for us as becoming future engineering managers, all right? Now, because even as managers or even as professional staff, we influence the culture that we are part of. So you don't have to just be an engineering manager. You can influence culture from the moment you walk into that door. Now, so how I usually look at this here. Now, I'll be using some of my case studies around different roles I've played, but I apply a mixture of stuff from the Caribbean when I worked, as well as here in Australia, and how some of it, what I have done or what I've noticed with some of my colleagues as well, how they have impacted on culture. And these techniques as well are applicable to you coming into your firms, and some of them actually really work and has been consistent. I've seen a lot of it building here over the past 2 years that how the company's culture has adjusted. And I've chatting with some of my colleagues here at the company. I'm only with the company full-time 2 years, and before that 2 years, I'm on a part-time casual basis while I was doing my PhD. And it was a difference of me doing it, working outside of the organization in a way as being part-time, going to clients' locations as a consultant, versus with me full-time in the organization, in the office, within the field, and understanding how they operate as well. Right. Now, one of the things that we look at is how we influence culture via these different methods, right? So recruitment, onboarding, and people operations have a structured, directed feel, right? We're deliberately determining what type of people that you bring into the organization, right? So they bring their own attitudes and biases into the organization. Now, depending where you're hired into, right, you can impact on the culture as well, right? Now, so when you get onto onboarding and people operation side of things, it gets a bit more organic feel to it. Now, also, it also becomes one of the more difficult parts of being an engineering manager, right? Now, how do you influence your culture via recruitment, onboarding, and people operations? Mm-hmm. Now, I've been involved in recruiting people for like over 20 years. Now, the recruitment can be volunteer leadership positions for sports teams. I remember starting off that when I was in high school. I was a sports captain and having to recruit people to be captains for the other sports teams, and then becoming the house captain. In the Caribbean and Australia, we tend to have these sports teams. It's different to the American experience where you have these varsity teams and that's it. And for us, we do have varsity teams as well in our schools, but we call them first 11s, depending if it's cricket or rugby. But we're also divided up into sports teams entire house. So if I go back to my high school, we had 4 houses and the entire school was divided up into it. You do this in primary school and high school. Primary you'll call elementary. High school that's middle and high school together. And we're put into these houses. So I'm recruiting people to become part of my teams, for my sports teams. I'm recruiting them also to become leaders as well. So you have that recruitment aspect, in terms of, and the culture of each house is different. I remember my house was very student-led. The teachers were involved, but the students were it's always a culture of student-led participation in our house. Other houses, teachers were very involved. So even in the school, we could have those, right? I've also had to be doing recruiting 3 staff offices across 3 different countries. When I was a shared services manager, I'm recruiting to bring people in Trinidad and Tobago, in Barbados, as well as in Jamaica. And again, those different countries have different cultures. And then when I've worked in project teams across, in Guyana, Barbados, and Grenada, I have, recruiting some of my project managers from Grenada for them to then travel across to Barbados and Guyana to supervise projects for me. So it was interesting doing that. Also then recruiting staff from an international here. I'm in Trinidad for a partner company. I'm recruiting someone from all the way across here, in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, for them to come and work for us here in Trinidad and Tobago. That's an interesting aspect of recruiting internationally. All right. And one thing I've always considered is that when I am trying to recruit here is that could they actually fit into the organization? Right? Can we hope, because we often hope that the person that we hire would fit in culturally for the company I work for. All right. Now, sometimes cultural fit will come up against what we call the cultural diverse approach. Like this approach, cultural fit approach versus the culturally diverse approach. So in other words, are we just hiring people who look and sound like us because it makes us easy for the organization to maintain a certain organizational culture, right? Or should we be hiring people who come from a varied background that provides alternative viewpoints that can help expand the organizational culture? Because that's a thing that we face here in recruitment. Because I look after recruitment as cultural fit, but also culturally a diverse organization. And that's something you may face when you may find yourself as engineering managers having to recruit into. It's a decision that the recruiters who are recruiting you are sometimes thinking about when they're basically hiring you into the organization. Now, to answer the first question, I would say, now there are justifications for hiring people from the same group to fit into your company's culture. We think and operate more in sync with each other. Decision making is generally easier, right? You think sometimes this is not as always the case, all right? Because groupthink can easily slip in as there's not enough alternative views, right? Now, additionally, toxic company behaviors can actually develop, and this has real implications. And we have stories of different companies where this groupthink has happened because everyone are the same and there's not enough diverse voices in the room. And that has implications for products and services being offered to the public. Now, as engineering managers, we should aim for a diverse workforce because we know that alternative views help us to innovate because we have different perspectives, right? We take into consideration the lived experiences of people who are going to use our products and services, especially as we come into the service industry. Even looking at some of the marketing that are done by some companies, we have memes. Memes are very useful things because you say a picture, that's cliche, a picture paints 1,000 words. And suddenly you just look at some of the memes that talk about, yes, we know that this company probably doesn't have enough diverse people there because clearly they would not have put that ad out had they actually had diverse people probably in the marketing team or said, oh, well, no, that ad should not go out there, right? And again, that sometimes our groupthink comes in. Because you're all thinking the same way, because your live experiences are the same thing, but you're probably not marketing your products or your services to the people correctly, to the people that you are talking to. Right? So for me, when I look at my recruitment strategy here, I try to do a full holistic approach where I try to recruit across genders, ethnic groups, countries of origin and languages. Right? Now, because I work in a technical environment, so I've been always in technical, so I've been working in energy, both in terms of downstream industries, ammonia and urea production. We talk about energy, sustainable energy, and now I'm here in construction as well. So therefore, we will often have to look at academic qualifications that get you into the door, right? So then we also have to look at how competent sometimes, in this case, where we're here in a consultancy firm, it's a lot of software is required to do the jobs that we do because we're talking about planning for projects. So we need to know planning software, or if you're in CAD visualization, got to know various CAD software. If in forensics, again, you need to have knowledge of forensic planning, in training, the ability to train and train people in software, business intelligence using BI tools. Right. So what we do here, we also have to look not just knowing you have the academic qualifications, but are also you competent in software tools. Now, while it's nice to say, we just look at qualifications and competencies, I must also consider the gender balance as well. Now, as I said, I mentioned I work in construction, so it's an area where there's a lot of dominance by applicants who are male presenting. And so in the last few positions, since I've taken over this role, I've been trying to push for recruiting staff for female presenting. Now, why don't this is all in good? What I've noticed that the pool of female presenting candidates is definitely smaller than male presenting candidates. Now, fixing this shortage is beyond the webinar, but what I will say here is that we probably will have to encourage more female presenting students into STEM subjects at high school and supporting them at universities, right? Because I can tell you this, every other recruiter in the industry who have gender and inclusion diversity goals to meet, we're all targeting that same 10 to 20 female presenting candidates versus the 80 to 90 male presenting candidates of a talent pool of 100. So I teach at university programs, and I remember having to call some of my top female presenting students. I'm like, oh my God, you're top of my class. Do you want to come and work for me? I was like, oh, I'm sorry, I got a job already. Oh, sorry, I have this cadet job. So it's like, I'm like, yes, of course. Smaller pool, everyone's trying to meet their targets of gender and inclusion at diversity quotas, or they're trying to get that. And so we're all targeting that same approach. And in reality, we have to go back to the source. We got to go back to encouraging more people into STEM subjects at an earlier age. So therefore they get feed into when they're ready at construction and engineering jobs. We don't all fighting for this small pool of candidates, right? Now, once I have hired our culturally and linguistically diverse staff, right? Now we could further influence them. And again, this is where we come in even when we get hired in the company, and we use this through in onboarding. Now, so as engineering managers, or you may be what's called a peer buddy if you're professional staff. We can introduce them to how we work. We can indoctrinate them into the process and procedures. For example, all of the operational ways working contributes to the culture, because the way you work contributes. You know, do we use Teams versus Zoom? All right. So, and because the onboarding process has this formal and informal components, right? This formal thing can be very simply put like explain how to register a design change in your document management system on work. So just even letting your colleague know who is the best person in the office, who is the best troubleshooter. You got to know that person. We all know, if we have worked before, there's someone who like, yeah, I'm going to go to that person because they get stuff done. All right, that's informal knowledge there. So, and the quirks of that office is not always told or written down. So what it is what we call the oral history, right? And this oral historian for the company often can be the longest person at the company, or it just happen to be someone who's really good at telling stories, which is an important aspect. That's the rule of an oral historian, right? Sometimes it happens inadvertently. For example, when I was in Trinidad, I became the oral historian because I was the first employee into the company. So I saw how we build and what was the culture there. And naturally, I'm an orator. I've been doing this for years. So it's like, okay, I'm going to tell a story. And culturally, you got to tell a story in Trinidad. If you don't tell a story, you're considered boring. You really got to tell that story. You know, you got to work it, you know. And then here in Australia, I ended up becoming part of the oral historian team because I look after onboarding now. I tap it, and so that's my role. But then I bring in my cultural background as a Trinidadian, where we tell a story, we weave a story, and hence I become one of the oral historians. There's other people as well who do the oral history. So one of the things that we look at here, and this is the part where we start to try to democratize culture. So it's not just that formal aspect here. We don't also have to depend on our head of company to initiate everything, because yes, we may need tacit approval from them, but these things work best when they're produced from the ground up. Right. So for example, when I came here in Australia, I saw one of the things that I had to get used to is that they love the games. They really love the game for trivia and drinks. And I had to really get used to on a Friday afternoon having drinks in the office. I'm like, hold up, drinks in the office? The company is buying us drinks. It's in the fridge. You're allowed to have a drink at a Friday meeting. I'm like, oh God. I was like, I can get on with this, you know. And at the time, our cadets, like our interns who joined, were responsible for organizing the games. And so we would create trivia questions, and we will do a Friday meeting, and then we'll have trivia. Everyone comes in, you'll have drinks and chips and actually have a good time. Now, we actually had to move on to like during COVID-19, when we were working from home, we started doing categories and online trivia. So that kept us really going because we had offices in 3 different states, right? And now we have even added word scrap in the morning. Well, this is all part of culture. This is building the team culture, and it's very organic because initially the word Scrabble was initially set up by a senior member, but it's now been passed on to a junior member of staff who is really good at Scrabble and has been keeping up that at 9 o'clock every morning, we get your word Scrabble. I think this week, the theme was all about chocolate. And has been having interesting conversations. Now you may think, oh, talking about games, like it is something that we really get on in the organization. And we found, and this is something that was interesting, how we did in Trinidad, we usually do it after work, but here this has been incorporated within the work culture, where we found that meals and drinks are an effective way to get to know people. So for example, we had the international staff, so therefore you have a range of foods, cuisines that we do. And what I found that the different offices has, they like drinking coffee here in Australia, they love it. And a lot of people get into that coffee drinking culture, where they have the rituals. So my planning team on a morning will call it a coffee club. They will go for coffee together. And they don't talk about work, they just get to know each other. And they maintain that throughout work from home during the lockdowns. And they do it over Teams. And that was really useful because one of our colleagues moved from Sydney to Melbourne, and he was Melbourne. I don't know if for the news is really Melbourne, that was actually competed with Sydney for being the most city on a lockdown. And he was the only one in the Melbourne office. So he really tapped into having that friendship and a collegiality with his colleagues here back in Sydney office. The Gold Coast office is a smaller office. It often is a whole of company affair, a whole of office affair. So everyone goes out for the coffee together, which was really good, right? And so that was that coffee drink. But then we had a card department. They tend to be very quiet, but because they're the largest international mix, they actually will go monthly dinners with for the department, and that person gets to choose a restaurant. And so therefore you get to see that diversity where they will sometimes choose a restaurant from their home countries, and everybody gets to actually do that and join in. And that's very organic. We actually have had, very big, then there's official company meals, of course, things like Biggest Tea, which is a cancer awareness fundraising event that we do across Australia. We do Welcome Back Tea, Christmas dinner, start of holidays. I know for me, I had to get used to it as well because I cook a certain way. And I remembered once, we did a welcome breakfast and I'm cooking my Caribbean style. I say Caribbean style because my mom is from a different island, different country, and we have very similar style of cooking sausages. And I'm like, I'm going to give you my sausages, like, oh, we cook it. And it's like, someone's like, there's too much ingredients. And I'm like, what? I'm like, no, you got to put ingredients in sausage, not the sizzle I have here on the picture. But I've worked out what to do. I got to do one ingredient dishes. So what I just do is I serve them some Caribbean style jerk chicken, flavored, of course, spicy, of course, full of pepper, of course, but it's one little dish. They get it. But what I do is I give it a cultural history, the story that goes with the meal, and it is often a hit. So again, I'm applying my culture of sharing of food at which we do in the Caribbean here in the Australian context. So we get to know staff, and it's actually something that we really do look forward to, where people really enjoy our get together. So at that moment, we get to know staff, and you're building people, and people are getting used. And that is really good. And especially the fact that our staff is diverse, it really helps people feel welcome into the office as well. And a number of staff from Australia have gone abroad and lived abroad and coming back. So therefore, they have experienced that aspect of moving to a new country. Now, the final piece for me, when I look at organizational culture, is people operations, all right? Now, this is the ongoing management of your subordinates, your peers, and your superiors. Even if you're junior staff, there is a people operation aspect of you managing your peers as well, or managing up. How do you handle your manager? Right? Now, we have to consider people operation has to be adaptable to culture, because what we are seeing here is that we experience a lot of external shocks, which means we have to now adapt to these things. All right. So we have to understand that these external factors are going to interact with your staff. As engineering managers, even if you're now coming into the organization, you have these external factors, in fact, that will impact the company, impact your members of staff in different ways, and they're bringing that to work. All right. And so therefore, that cultural minefield can seem a lot. All right. And so one of the ways I look at that is you got to approach it to understand, when they're learning and understanding where your privileges lie, and everyone has different privileges in different ways. And, we have had to deal with shocks that impact internal culture. From an Australian, American, or Caribbean perspective, we have attempted coups. We had political disagreements that are coming out, and you're seeing it played out in the streets. Aboriginal Lives Matters, Black Lives Matter movements. We have border closures, which have also then activated. We have refugees. And I'm saying this from looking at Treat's perspective, me from Trinidad and Tobago, from Australia and America. We are all facing these things as well. Climate crisis, raising energy prices. We had the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine hesitancy, the #MeToo movement, gender and sexual identities. All of these things impact, and they bring a reckoning for some of us. We have to handle them. We have to deal with that. As an engineering manager, these people can't just turn these things off and say, okay, once I come to work, oh, I'm going to turn this off. Like, no, they're these people's lived experience, right? And I have had to deal with that as a people and culture manager here in Australia, right? So the way I look at it is when I operate in culture, the way I prepare myself is I have a framework that is based on equity, equality, lived experience, science and technology, and social constructs. The social constructs are an important aspect that's helped us understand gender roles, sexual identities. They're very important to understand that experience there and someone's lived experience and what they're facing, and understanding where you may face something may not be, doesn't matter. For some people, it's a big thing. And in terms of that equity and equality, in terms of how we work and addressing systemic work, depending on what company we're working for, that we may have a bigger role to play in addressing equality and equity demands. And of course, being in a construction firm, a consultancy firm, science and technology is something that we have to use, decision making. But at the same time, that impacts on people's lived experience. So now, because I've had an institutional economics background, all right, now I've been able to better structure how we deal with these external factors. And that's why I say you gotta have a framework. Frameworks help. I'm in construction, so frameworks, we're building up a framework that gets me something structured. You're coming into engineering, you're gonna be, even if it's a new person, you gotta have that framework, assess yourself, that gets you in a proper particular way. So it allows you to navigate these numerous factors that impact on people's lives, all right? For example, one of the things, and what I said this year, I've really been consolidating my roles of people and culture. And one of the reasons that has happened, we used to have 6 people doing different elements of our people and culture functions. But because of the COVID pandemic, I've basically been having to take them, put them under my wing, because we need to have a more stable, nuanced way of doing our whole of company people and culture. For example, I'm a COVID marshal, right? And I've had to bring staff along to understand the various vaccination mandates, border restrictions and hygiene practices that we have now had to implement across the company, right? I had to approach this as learning moments, all right? And allowing staff to ask questions. I personally message each staff member to understand how they were coping with COVID-19, because now our staff was not just coming from Australia, but they were also coming from other countries. And so we had this shared experience where, we are probably not able to travel across state borders. So even not just between New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland or the ACT, but also families abroad being able to leave international borders as well. And so we often will avoid some of the political discussions from an official or staff perspective, but we will still have engagements and peer-to-peer discussions. You could have certain relationships. We could talk about the political decisions around these COVID restrictions that we're facing, but from a whole of company perspective, it was more of a general guidelines that we always follow official advice. Right. So again, because we do acknowledge that people will have different political views and it just don't turn them off. So company wouldn't necessarily take a side, but we're operating a regulatory framework as one day's requirement of a company that has on a work health and safety legislation that has for staff, but there's also that people aspect that people are affected by what was happening with COVID-19. Now, it did help that 100% of our staff had opted for vaccination before our industry mandates were actually issued. So in construction, we were required, because construction in the first lockdown, we have had 2 major lockdowns in where we operated. Construction were allowed to operate in the various, but with Delta wave, we had to take a different view, and so they introduced vaccination mandates that were required. So we were really ahead of the curve, because I initially did a risk assessment and said 3 of our commercial departments had to basically get vaccinated, because we were the ones going on site and we were interacting with people. And if we go back to the office, we might bring that back to the office. But then I realized I should check with the other departments as well. And other departments said, yep, they're all going to get it as well. And so it was an easier sell for us that everyone got vaccinated before, because then the mandates came in for construction that you had to have it to get onto construction sites. And in my role, I traveled in most of my company, and I was like, there's no way I could get on the plane and go to another part of the country without being vaccinated. So I was like, okay, there we go. So it was an interesting experience having to handle that and deal with that. Now, while COVID-19 right now might be the biggest challenge for some of us and people in cultural roles, and it may seem as a cultural, for me, I see it as a public health matter, we have to understand there are other minefields waiting. And the way I prepare myself for it is to have a framework to make your decision, understand where your privilege lies in terms of socioeconomic and sociocultural factors, because our decision making is based on those factors, right? You consult with people, you make your decision, because once you could base a decision on some sort of framework, it is harder for you to fit the argument for bias to be upset you've set in. And you have to then take in consideration where everyone is coming from. And I had to take, and I said COVID-19 was a very interesting one for me to handle, because I remembered when I was in Trinidad, and I was in commercial project management, and we were flying across to different sites. And one of the requirements I had to put into staff who were traveling officers, do you have your vaccination for yellow fever and for tetanus? Because you're flying to another country and those countries have that vaccination requirement, but you're going onto a site and if you get injured, we need to make sure you're protected. And for me, it was, okay, cool. It was generally accepted that you will do that. To get into certain companies in the industry, you actually, part of your recruitment process on your onboarding was bringing in vaccinations and getting checked by the nurse. I was on site I worked for ammonia company. I actually had to go to the environmental doctor to get tested because of the high risk job I was in. It was part of our medical checkup and history. So it was a norm. But in here, and because of the political nature of what happened with COVID, I had to take it I could not go an all company mandate. I had to go. We check the legislation around mandates, then have a conversation with each staff member to understand where they were coming from, because it required a more nuanced approach. And that was me understanding the political environment at which COVID was happening, but also understanding that people had different lived experience to dealing with vaccinations in their home countries and as well in Australia. So there was I had to change my approach that way I did in Trinidad. And 2 times, in every single time I've had to work, it was like that. It was required as part of the employment package. This is what you got to do because of your risk factors. And so it was different to here, where I had to be a bit more gentle and nuanced. But I based my decision making on a framework as to how I'm going to approach this, at the time, a minefield that we experienced. So and so that's me here. And one of the things when I look at saying about culture is, and dealing with in terms of how you adapt into the professional workspace, you can't hide away from your cultural identity. You can try to hide it, but some of us can't hide it. So you ask, what is your cultural identity? What do you bring to the organization? And that can bring your cultural identity, can even come in from your academic background as well. Being an industrial engineer, I have a different perspective to how I operate versus if someone's coming in as an accountant or someone coming in as someone who's did business or civil engineering, right? And then how do you adapt to that culture? Remember, culture is not just national culture. You also have the company culture. Moving from one company to the other might be different, or moving from one industry to the other will be a different approach. Here in construction, I can actually have a beard, but when I worked in oil and gas and ammonia, I couldn't have a beard. I actually was clean shaven. I had a lot of mustache. And again, because there's a safety culture that required even facial hair, because we have to wear face masks. So moving from one industry to the other allowed me to even have facial hair again. How do you adapt to the culture when I move, from commercial project management to shared services? And there's a difference in feel and how you operate in a business. All right. So Ona, that's me here, and I will open the floor to any questions that we have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maynard. We're now going to answer questions. I do not see any questions so far. So just a reminder, please submit any questions or comments you have for Dr. Maynard in the chat, and I will read out your questions to him. But while we wait for questions, I have one of my own. So what would you consider the main challenge that people face in adapting to the culture of a company that they just joined?
I think one of the challenges is just trying to understand the unwritten rules of how the company does things,
Okay.
right? For example, like as I said, moving from one company to the other, you might have in a company everyone goes to lunch together, but then sometimes in the other company, in the new company you've joined, people don't go to lunch together. Like you do your own thing for lunch, like something as simple as that, or where if you're requesting leave, is like, do you need to fill out a form, or do you just shoot an email to your line manager? And like, getting used to and also even the use of first names. Like in my company here in Australia, one of the things I actually had to get used to was the fact that we just use first names. Like we don't say Mr. this or Miss this. We just call you by the first name. So I couldn't call my managing director Dave like that. I don't have to call him Mr. whatever his name is. I don't. Like, so it's these unwritten rules. So hopefully you have a buddy, an onboarding buddy, who could probably give you some of these little tips and tricks to navigating the organization.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Maynard.
Yeah.
So there is a question from Dr. Cedric, ASEM president. He said, do you have suggestions for integrating new members via mentors or coaches on the corporate norms?
Yes, actually, that's a good question. That's what we do. So what we do is that for every department has a particular culture. So usually you'll identify the person who's probably the most competent in your team and who embodies the best of what you want. And you ask them, could you be a mentor for new staff? So every new staff member who joins the company should be assigned a mentor. And because that allows them to get those unwritten rules, then they know who they're someone to ask for questions. All right. And so what we do is that so what we have done, and I'll come and using the example, I've had 2 new staff members started this week, one yesterday and one on Monday, and they've been assigned to senior staff members who was going to guide them on how we operate. All right. And we tell them, okay, you got to explain to them how we operate, show them the ropes, like these are the processes, the procedures. All right. And so they're responsible for that. But then what we do is we have backup mentors. So there's 3 of us who serve as a backup mentors. So we come in on the social aspects. We will check with them and say, hey, how are you doing? And I will do check-in calls and I'll give them the lowdown around. There's something simple as I have a staff member who has to come up for Christmas and say, mate, I'm the one who travels the most in the company, and I'm going to tell you what you got to do for traveling and things like that. So you have a backup mentor who will cover some of the social aspects as well. So you always got to have mentors. Like there's no way around. You can give them a handbook, but nothing beats having someone explain things to you. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Maynard. There's the next question is from Mohanad Goma. The question is, does my choice of culture diversity or culture fit to company's ideology depend solely on my target audience? Are there any other considerations?
That's a good one. Definitely. Right. So it depends on what you're working with. All right. Depends on your perspective. When you say target audience, is that if you're targeting if you're a service company facing a wide range of customers, say if you're working for a bank, engineering managers can work in banks, then you generally probably want to have a culturally diverse group of employees because you might be targeting differently culturally diverse communities if that's where you want to operate. So you want to target that as well. All right. If for me, like a construction consultancy firm, we work with companies directly, and in some roles it may work. In other words, it doesn't matter. For example, my CAD team is culturally diverse. Some of them at times may not speak their grades 8 or 9 on IELTS in English, but that's fine. because they don't want to talk to clients, they're producing content. The quality of their work is the output of the CAD material. And so we have an incredibly diverse crew in my CAD department, and some of our staff, some of our clients don't even know, because all they're seeing is the end work. Whereas, say, for some of our front-facing roles, like, for example, I'm in front-facing and training. I have a lot of programming consultants. The key thing first, we're culturally diverse, but we all have a good command of English because we are operating in an English-speaking country. So it factors differs, all right? So your consideration really comes down to your community you're going to be serving, and then in terms of what is expected of them. And it can still be diverse as well. In my companies, I think probably one of the most diverse I've faced, where I travel across countries and I'm like, companies, I'm like, boom, I'm probably the only diversity that they have in that room for the day. I was like, okay, that's fine, but I'm doing my job. All right. In other cases, I'm like, oh, there we are. Yay. Yeah, diverse people. Sweet. So it all depends on the company that you're going to work with. There's no easy or right answer for this, really, mate. Like, really, it's theirs. And it's just as how I apply for my recruitment process is, as I said, competency academics come in, but then I can weave some of the weaknesses of or skill sets of certain people because their role doesn't have to require to face clients. If you have to face clients, I definitely got to look at, say, things like your ability to speak English for the clients to understand you. And because we are consultants, that's one of the things I have to take into consideration.
It looks like we've covered all our questions. Thank you, Dr. Maynard, for a great presentation. It was a pleasure to have you with us. On behalf of ASEM, thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Same to you. Thank you very much for having me. Okay then. Bye-bye.